Jacob asked his father-in-law Laban if he could take his wives and kids away from Padan Aram and back to his homeland in Canaan. But Laban wanted him to stay, and he told him to name his price for staying. And so Jacob said he wanted all of the speckled and striped sheep from Laban's flocks, and so Laban gave them to him. And whenever a speckled or spotted lamb was born from all the flocks, it was given to Jacob. Jacob then schemed to get all of Laban's flocks by only letting Laban's sheep mate with sheep that were speckled or had stripes, so that typically only lambs with these characteristics were born. Jacob even goes so far as to set up sticks in front of the flocks with spots or stripes carved onto them in order to help the flocks to think about spotted and striped things while they copulate, which sounds kind of superstitious or even stupid today, but back then that seemed like it might be a pretty good technique. And Jacob became wealthy because of these schemes. But Laban and his sons began to treat Jacob and his family so poorly that Jacob decided to up and move his family out of there. God also told Jacob to go back to the land of his fathers. So while Laban was off shearing his sheep, Jacob loaded up all of his family, herds, and possessions and took off for Canaan. Additionally, Rachel stole her father's household gods before they ran. After 3 days, Laban found out and chased Jacob all the way to Gilead. God spoke to Laban and told him not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. But Laban began to accuse Jacob, telling him he shouldn't have left, and he accused Jacob of stealing his household gods. And Jacob confessed his fear that Laban would take his family from him, and he also insisted that he hadn't stolen anything. Laban then began searching everybody's tents one by one. When Laban came to Rachel's tent, she hid the gods by sitting on them and told him she couldn't stand up because she was on her period. Laban never found his gods, but that is to be expected, since they didn't seem to be very powerful gods in the first place. Powerless, in fact, to free themselves from being desecrated by Rachel's menstrual cycle, it seems. So Jacob and Laban made a covenant together and promised never to harm each other again, as God was their witness. They also set up a pile of rocks and promised never to cross that boundary into each other's territory. And Laban left after saying goodbye to his daughters and grandkids. The text then says that Jacob went on his way, and that while he went, he was greeted by angels of God. Jacob then sent messengers to his brother Esau to let him know that he had decided to return home. When the messengers came back, they warned Jacob that Esau was on his way with 400 men. Jacob was afraid and divided his family up into different groups, hoping that if Esau attacked one group, the others might escape. Jacob also began to pray to the God of his fathers and begged him to save him and his family from Esau's wrath. He also sent servants ahead with gifts of hundreds of sheep, goats, donkeys, and camels for Esau. But Jacob crossed over the river into the wilderness, and he spent the night alone. And the text says that a man wrestled with Jacob all night long. At dawn, the man tried to leave, but Jacob demanded that he give him his blessing first. And the man renamed Jacob to Israel, saying, "It is because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Israel means he struggles with God. And the man blessed him and was suddenly gone. Jacob named the place where he saw the man Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." Peniel means face of God. What we see here is a common theme in these narratives. The main character encounters someone who appears to the senses to be human, but at some point in the conversation, the main character realizes that they are speaking with no ordinary person, but in fact with God himself. The biblical characters are often in a fog, and they are unaware that God has been with them until he makes himself known to them. This happens throughout the Old Testament, but is also seen in the New Testament, especially among Jesus' closest followers after he has been resurrected. All of these characters are experiencing something that is beyond their understanding, and their senses ultimately fail them until God reveals himself. This is the story of how Jacob became Israel, how he struggled with God and overcame. But it is also the story of an entire nation, one chosen to have a special relationship with God, one that would change them forever. This story is a taste of how one man and one nation were chosen by God, and how they struggled with this God that they didn't understand. And this story is also about us, and how we have struggled with God, how we have overcome, and how God has forever left his mark on us. We are Israel. At dawn, Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming with his 400 men, and Jacob divided his family into groups again, placing his favorite wife Rachel and his favorite son Joseph in the back of the procession to keep them safe, and placing the slave girls and their sons towards the front. Though this obvious favoritism most likely did not go unnoticed by the boys, and will probably come back to haunt Joseph later. Jacob, thinking death was near, approached Esau alone and bowed before him 7 times. But Esau ran up to Jacob, and he hugged him and kissed him, and they both wept. Esau was amazed by all of Jacob's family and greeted all of them. Esau asked Jacob why he had sent so many hundreds of animals in their direction, and Jacob explained that they were gifts for his master Esau. Esau said he had enough animals and told Jacob to take them back, but Jacob insisted, so Esau accepted the gift. Jacob and Esau agreed to meet up later in Esau's homeland of Seir, but after Esau left, Jacob moved his family someplace else because he was still a little bit afraid of Esau, and Jacob and his family settled near the city of Shechem. Sometime later, some guy from the city of Shechem, whose name was Shechem, raped Jacob's daughter Dinah. Yet the text also says that Shechem loved her and spoke tenderly to her, and he said to his father, "Get me this girl as my wife." Now when Jacob found out what happened, he didn't do anything until his sons came back from the fields, and Jacob's sons were furious when they found out. But then Shechem and his father show up and offer Jacob and his sons any price to pay for Dinah to be his bride. And so Jacob's sons tricked the people of Shechem into entering into a covenant of circumcision with them. After 3 days, while all the men were still in pain from their little procedure, Levi and Simeon came into town and slaughtered every male they could find. They murdered Shechem and his dad and rescued Dinah from their house. The rest of Jacob's sons then carried off all the loot, including all the animals, women, and children. Jacob was angry with Simeon and Levi and told them that their family was now a stench in the nostrils of all their neighbors, and that what they had done could lead to all their neighbors ganging up on them and wiping them out. And they bluntly responded, "Should he have treated our sister like a whore?" God then spoke to Jacob and told him to go back to Bethel, the place where they had first met. But before they left, Jacob made everyone with him get rid of their foreign gods, and Jacob buried all the idols under the oak tree at Shechem. The text then says that the terror of God fell upon everyone they passed, so that no one pursued them. And after this, the text repeats a shorter version of the story of Jacob's return to Canaan, when God changed his name to Israel. Later, they left Bethel, and on the way, Rachel went into labor but began to have complications. The midwife said to her, "Don't despair, for you have another son," indicating that the baby was being born breech, which tended to go very poorly for the mother, especially in the time before C-sections. As Rachel was dying, she named her son Ben-oni, which means son of my trouble or son of my sorrow. After Rachel died, Jacob changed his son's name to Benjamin, which means son of my right hand or son of my strength. And Jacob buried Rachel. And as if things couldn't get any worse, the text also mentions that sometime after they moved on, Reuben slept with his father's concubine Bilhah, and Jacob found out about it. And yeah, this will probably come back to haunt Reuben later on. The text also presents a list of the 12 sons of Israel, and it says that later Jacob returned to his father Isaac at Mamre, and that Isaac died at the age of 180 and was gathered to his people. And chapter 35 ends with Jacob and Esau burying their father together. Chapter 36 is an extensive list of all of Esau's descendants and all of the rulers of Edom, and not something that's especially interesting to most people, so if you want to learn more about it, you can read it for yourself. And that's pretty much the story of Jacob. We'll hear a bit more about him later, but from this point on, the book of Genesis is pretty much focused on how his sons turned out, especially his favorite son, Joseph. Even Jacob's own narrative is in a way centered on the story of Joseph, with Joseph's birth and the healing of Rachel's womb lying at the center, surrounded by stories of reproductive conflict, conflict with in-laws, visions of God, conflicts between brothers, conflicts with neighbors, the casting off of the so-called sacred, and ultimately the naming, and more importantly, the renaming of Jacob.